Greetings, everybody from Vancouver, Canada. I'm very sorry not to be able to join you in person today, but I'm grateful to Professor Darcy for the invitation to talk to you via this video link, and privileged to be on a panel with professionals whose work I know and admire. I've been asked to speak to you about one aspect of the relationship between atrocity, commerce, and international criminal justice, and I thought I would focus on some previous work that I did on pillage of natural resources in particular. Now, pillage just means theft during war. And when I talk about pillage, it normally for most people evokes images of Vikings and 16th century raids on towns where property is stolen. But actually, pillage is a modern war crime instantiated in international humanitarian law that's incorporated into all incarnations of international criminal justice. And it's prosecuted as a matter of course. A whole range of people have been prosecuted for pillaging different types of property, but what's distinct about the ways in which the many pillage prosecutions have taken place in international criminal justice over this last several decades is that it's generally focused on two types of actors, either military or politicians who have been stealing property like fridges, cars, money, livestock, and so on and so forth. And what my project in the past has focused on is making a twofold modification to that particular focus in ways that brings back a whole series of pillage cases from the Second World War. And the twofold modification looks like this. Instead of focusing on property that's epiphenomenal to armed conflict, you invade a particular town and you take the chickens, the money, the fridges, whatever property that you can to sort of remunerate yourself as a byproduct of the armed violence. You start to think more about the ways in which pillage can focus on illegal exploitation of natural resources in resource wars, i.e. the sorts of property that is both means and motivation for armed violence in a number of different contexts. And the second modification is to think about the ways in which politicians and military are responsible for pillaging natural resources, but also the ways that this implicates business people and corporations as well. And as things transpire, as I mentioned earlier, there's a great number of precedents for these sorts of prosecutions after the Second World War. Walter Funk was prosecuted within the Nuremberg judgment itself. He was the chairperson of the Continental Oil Company, which was charged with pillaging prodigious amounts of oil from throughout occupied Europe. Hans Plieger was another who was tried and convicted for pillaging coal, manganese, and other sorts of natural resources. And so part of my work has to be thinking about how is it that there's some strangely regressive element to modern international criminal law. If these sorts of prosecutions were front and center at Nuremberg, why is it that they've been left out in international criminal justice in its modern instantiation since the fall of the Berlin Wall? And my work on these sorts of topics is a third of a much broader focus, which also thinks about the responsibility of arms vendors as accomplices in international crimes, and then finally the responsibility of individuals who hire private military companies using the doctrine of superior responsibility. I just want to talk to you today about pillage, and because I'm not there to show you a PowerPoint or anything of that sort, I thought it would be best if I started with a roadmap of sorts that let you know precisely where we're going to go in the next 40 minutes or so as I talk about this subject. And in essence, I propose to do three things with you in the time that remains for me. The first is to talk to you about, well, how did I end up working on these sorts of issues? Where does this idea of applying pillage to illegal exploitation of natural resources and to think about commercial responsibility in this context, where does this come from and how does this fit into how international criminal justice works presently? And through that process, I hope to give you sort of an idea of where things are at presently in thinking about this issue. Then I want to talk to you very briefly about what I perceive to be pillage's potentially transformative effect. And there are a number of different levels that I could speak to about that, but I'm going to limit myself to just two. And those are, first, the ways in which refocusing international criminal law has potentially transformative effects for business and human rights. I'll say more about that. And then secondly, how focusing on these sorts of cases might also have important consequences for the legitimacy of international criminal justice itself. So those are the two aspects of the second part that I want to speak to you about. In the final part, I want to raise and discuss a set of objections to using pillage in international criminal justice to focus on the dynamics of resource predation in resource wars. And here there are three. First, that using pillage of natural resources like this will have counterproductive effects for local populations who are dependent on illegal exploitation of natural resources within survival economies. And that will be the first objection. The second objection that I want to talk to you about is the idea, well, this is actually undermining fundamental tenets of international humanitarian law that posit that the law, international criminal law and international humanitarian law, should be neutral between warring factions. Pillage actually favors states, so doesn't that undermine some of the core ideas behind international humanitarian law that are infused in international criminal justice? And finally, a series of more critical perspectives on ways in which this could also have counterproductive effects, and whether really international criminal justice is best suited to dealing with the realities of conflict diamonds and everything else that isn't diamonds but is susceptible to the same dynamic. So let me talk to you a little bit about how I came to be focused on these sorts of issues for the last 10 to 15 years. I first became interested when I was working as a very young lawyer 16 years ago at the Rwanda Tribunal, and it struck me that really we weren't permitted to see the Rwandan genocide as limited in space or time. When I was there, there were massacres of a similar amplitude taking place just across the border in the Congo, and it struck me that there were terrible continuities with the Rwandan genocide in two dimensions. First, it was literally a continuation of the violence in Rwanda transposed across the border. And then in the second terrible continuity, it seemed to me that the same sorts of international myopia and disinterest that had allowed the Rwandan genocide to continue in the ways that it had were really revisited vis-a-vis the Congo. I mean, really, it was 100 miles away that these sorts of massacres were taking place. And when one's involved in investigating these sorts of things, those sorts of anomalies, shall we say, aren't just sort of abstract political ideas. They become considerably more personal and become considerably more difficult. And so for my sins, I resolved that the Congo would be a core piece of what I work on over the years to come. And so I followed with interest the establishment by the UN Security Council in 2001 of a panel of experts charged with investigating the relationship between illegal exploitation of natural resources on the one hand and continuation of armed violence in the Congo characterized by egregious human rights violations. And over the course of 3 years of investigation, 6 or 7 reports, this panel of experts unearths what it describes as a self-sustaining war economy, creating win-win situations for all belligerents, making any attempt to resolve the conflict exceptionally difficult because a whole set of people are, by definition, making a handsome profit off violence. And as things transpire, the Congo is no exception to this dynamic. Illegal exploitation of natural resources has substituted for superpower sponsorship as a predominant means of conflict financing since the end of the Cold War. And so, in a way, I stumbled into the Congolese experience as an outsider, observed these dynamics, but then realized that they were actually important dynamics in a whole range of different contexts. That's not to say that they're the only motivating factor for violence. Obviously, there are all sorts of underlying causal explanations for why violence takes place in a range of different countries, and these vary significantly. But in each of these instances, natural resources were playing an important role, and it struck me that the exploitation of natural resources by warring factions was almost always pillage. I'll come back to that in just a moment. And of course, all of this folds into the famed resource curse, whereby the richest nations in terms of latent mineral wealth are in fact the poorest in terms of all measure of social development and human flourishing. And war, of course, is a major factor in that particular dynamic. But what struck me as really interesting at the end of this process was that there was a triangular diagram in the final report of this panel of experts. And this particular triangular diagram struck me as very significant. So at the apex of the triangle was continuation of armed violence characterized, as I mentioned, by terrible human rights violations. Independent research suggests 5.4 million excess civilian Congolese died as a consequence of this war. So staggering numbers. But in the two peripheries of the triangle are foreign commercial inputs. And the first is illegal exploitation of natural resources that provides any aggrieved party with sufficient resources to fund an armed violence indefinitely. And in the other side of the triangle, illicit weapons flows, which they use money from the illegal exploitation of natural resources to purchase weapons to create more human rights violations, back to the apex of the triangle, that provokes more and more people to want to enter into violence, which produces more focus on illegal exploitation of natural resources, and thus this dark downward spiral into darkness. I call it the vicious triangle. And one of the things that struck me looking at this triangle, I was then working as a prosecutor at the Yugoslav Tribunal. One of the things that struck me was we as prosecutors focus too much on the apex of the triangle. We focus too much on crimes like torture and rape and deportation and crimes of this sort once an atrocity has run its terrible course. Better, I thought, or at least important also, to think about focusing on the other aspects of the triangle. And what happened, by the way, to those cases post-Second World War where prosecutors did focus on both those aspects of the triangle. As I mentioned, there are a whole range of cases of business people being prosecuted for pillaging natural resources because they were part and parcel of the Nazi apparatus. And there were a range of instances where providing the means for atrocities were also prosecuted as complicity in atrocity. And so this began a long process of work and thinking. On my part, I left the Yugoslav Tribunal to work on these particular issues and fast forward through a range of different initiatives. The most relevant developments on these issues are that a year or so ago, a Swiss prosecutor formally opened a case against a company called Aragor Heraeus for pillaging for, money laundering that was derivative of pillaged Congolese natural resources. That case was not formally prosecuted, but it was an important formal investigation, and the consequences, I think the messaging to the industry was significant. In a similar sort of case, Belgian prosecutors arrested a Belgian businessman named Michel de Sedelia, who unfortunately died in custody before he could face charges for pillage and slavery around diamonds exploited from mines in Sierra Leone. I want to say a little bit about de Sedelia, the charges against de Sedelia. I personally don't know whether they're true or not. I know just what the charges were. And because they, in a way, debunk some of the thinking that pervades our approach to corporate responsibility for international crimes. So the allegations against de Sedelia were that it wasn't so much that he was auxiliary or just peripheral to the violence that took place in Sierra Leone. The allegations are that he cajoled Charles Taylor, the former president of Liberia, to invade parts of Sierra Leone, particularly for the diamonds, that he collaborated with the brutal rebel group RUF in Sierra Leone for this, that he personally flew with the RUF to diamond-rich areas to provide machinery, and that he was there personally as they did this, using slaves to exploit the diamonds in the region. And this is significant because if those allegations are true, and as I say, I don't know anything about the veracity of them, but if those allegations are true, it's not so much that JStewart is complicit. He really is a co-perpetrator. He is really a driving force behind these. So much of what you will hear about in this relationship is about complicity or aiding and abetting, but really there's a whole series of instances that transcend the aiding and abetting paradigm. I also just want to touch on the fact that pillage often goes hand in hand with slavery. And that shouldn't be surprising. I.G. Farben, for instance, was convicted of both pillage and slavery. And as we'll see in just a moment when I come to some of the objections, there are a whole series of allegations where pillage is achieved through slave labor. And that has important implications for some of the ways we think about objections to this use of pillage. So let me change gear and move into the second part of what I want to speak with you about, and that is pillage's potentially transformative effect. And here I want to raise initially the idea that pillage in particular and international criminal justice in general provide business and human rights with a missing binding legal framework that it has always sought. Now, as a field, it's probably fair to say that business and human rights has been characterized by an almost pathological quest to move beyond voluntarism, which is the name of a very important report in this. And that is to say, to move beyond a situation where human rights only bind businesses because businesses have magnanimously professed allegiance to human rights standards that exist in core texts like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In a way, that's a strange sort of a situation where it's regulation by conflict of interest. It's saying, we are bound by human rights because we profess allegiance to them. Well, what if you don't profess allegiance to them? Or what if your profession of allegiance to them is shallow and intended as a smokescreen? There aren't that many situations where we regulate other entities through their own profession, through their own sort of coming forward and saying, we think we'll follow these rules. Business and human rights has always been searching for a more vertical relationship, always been searching for something that's binding, regardless of whether businesses say they're going to adhere to human rights. Now, the core difficulty with this is that notwithstanding the work of several important scholars, human rights have traditionally been understood as being owed by states and states alone. And that has produced this sudden embrace of the Alien Tort Statute because it promised to move us beyond this voluntary system where corporations only took on human rights obligations voluntarily. The Alien Tort Statute promised to say, well, we bind them directly and we will have we will give to any type of litigant the possibility of suing corporations through this particular mechanism. There's an interesting case before the Supreme Court in the United States now to assess whether corporations can be held responsible to the Alien Tort Statute, but already a previous case so diminished the functionality of the Alien Tort Statute that one wonders how significant this will prove as a mechanism that solves the core dilemma in business and human rights. But here's the thing about international criminal justice. It also solves that core dilemma by attaching directly to business people, so reaching into corporations and attaching individual criminal responsibility to business people provided they satisfy the elements of international crimes. And then in national systems, corporate criminal liability exists to extrapolate backwards from the individual who's responsible for the international crime into the corporation under certain prescribed circumstances. So in a way, it's a fascinating situation where international criminal justice in both national and international courts can already address some of these aspects that people have been searching for in business and human rights for some period. Now, in your minds, you will, I hope, at this point be saying, how does that work? Because pillage is an aspect of international humanitarian law, and human rights are an aspect of human rights treaties. Both are components of public international law. So how is it that international humanitarian law and international criminal law that draws on it, how is it that they are able to do what international human rights law is not? And here there are really three reasons why international criminal law is understood as being capable of binding individual business people in ways that human rights can't necessarily. The first is that there was a gradual diminution of the function of reciprocity in international humanitarian law. So international humanitarian law started by being reciprocal relations, and slowly things like reprisals died out. And that made international humanitarian law more vertical in relationship. It was more of a set of core principles that everyone owes if they sign these treaties, rather than a sort of a contract between warring parties where breach on one side justifies breach on the other. So that was one of the significant developments. Another was that international humanitarian law treaties, as distinct from human rights treaties, already officially purport to bind actors other than states. And this in particular arose from the extension of international humanitarian law principles to non-international armed conflicts, by implication rebel groups who aren't states. So the distance between that and extending it to individuals and states, individuals and corporations, is not quite as far as it is in human rights, which purport to bind states and states alone. Finally, the big transition was at Nuremberg with this famous adage, which you will have heard a number of times: international crimes are committed by men, not abstract entities. And so the idea here is we're reaching into the state to attach individual criminal responsibility to individuals, and by the same process of reaching through abstract entities to isolate individual criminal responsibility, international criminal law has always and can still reach through corporations to attach responsibility to business people as appropriate. The ironic twist about redeploying that idea within the context of domestic criminal law that start with a guilty business person and then extrapolate backwards into corporate criminal responsibility is that potentially through that extrapolation, international criminal law is again about abstract entities. Let me put that aside for just a moment to reiterate the idea that focusing on pillage for international criminal justice can have potentially transformative effects for a number of fields, in this instance business and human rights, because it provides it with a pre-existing framework that already binds business people and their corporations. The next area that I want to talk to you about, the next transformative effect, is on international criminal justice itself as a field. And part of my theory, my thinking about this is that it actually has potential to augment, to increase the claims to justice and the claims to legitimacy that international criminal justice might have. And really the core difficulty for international criminal justice has always been its selectivity, the fact that it's applied to some people and not others on bases which are largely deferential to politics, not principle. And so this goes back all the way to ideas of victus justice, where the justice dispensed at Nuremberg and Tokyo is all focused on vanquished enemy, despite no shortage of allied offending. That was well documented and well understood. And so you emerge from that experience with this concept of victus justice. Well, how is that as a system of justice if only the fact that you lose is the primary determinant of whether you're held responsible? And so the modern instantiation of this is the argument from people like Rwandan President Paul Kagame that the International Criminal Court is a neo-colonial tool bent on the control of modern African states. Now, I always found that particular argument overstated, but it's hard to overlook the spectacle of the ICC indicting the most senior politicians from Sudan and the Congo for pillaging property that is epiphenomenal to armed conflicts, cattle, fridges, money, when there's no attempt to address the corporate responsibility for pillaging natural resources that is a primary driver for resource wars in the first place. And there's another aspect to this that I think is important that I've repeated a number of times, and that is focusing on pillage helps undermine a type of fallacy that has at least traditionally emanated from the International Criminal Court about why it focuses on only Africans. And that justification for the longest time was this: the International Criminal Court focuses mostly on Africans because Africa produces, numerically speaking, the most important atrocities. But there's a fallacy in that justification that pillage helps expose. And the fallacy is this: it assumes that only Africans are responsible for atrocity in Africa. And to make that assumption ignores the long history of flooding African conflicts with second-generation weaponry to offset the cost in first-world countries. It overlooks the well-documented history of private military companies engaged in atrocities and engaged in war crimes at the behest of various states in Africa. And most importantly for our purposes, it ignores the long history of pillaging natural resources that dates to colonialism, and the deleterious human rights consequences of those practices that date, at least in the Congo, for instance, to the time of King Leopold. And so part of what my thinking around pillage of natural resources has been is that potentially by focusing on these sorts of offenses, you get to undermine Kagame's neo-colonial critique, because Western states are able to hold their own business people responsible for implication in African atrocities. You get to address the fallacy in the prosecutor's discourse about Africa being most important by saying, well, you may continue to focus on Africa because numerically it does produce the largest number of atrocities. But when Westerners are implicated in those atrocities, we also hold them accountable, which, again, comes back to the victor's justice paradigm and explains away this deep partiality within the system, or at least partially explains away this deep partiality. So let me come then to the final part where I talk a bit more about objections. So here there are three, and I will start with the first, which is, so much exploitation of natural resources in Africa and elsewhere is already illegal formally. It's never really been legal. The whole idea of legality was a formal colonial imposition. And so by insisting on legality in the same sorts of ways that you do now, you're effectively creating perverse incentives for a return to violence. You're doing this because so many people depend on illegal exploitation of natural resources in quote-unquote survival economies, that if you dry that up suddenly, you are going to create one avenue for recourse, which is a return to armed violence. And I want to be exceptionally careful about this. This is a very important set of ideas that require some real investigation in an interdisciplinary way to think about how these dynamics might play out. I also think it's very case sensitive, so it's not, these sorts of arguments I think are not applicable in every context in the same sorts of ways. There needs to be a great deal more interdisciplinary social science research about how this might function in specific contexts. But let me express some skepticism about the argument from general, specific, and conceptual bases to begin with. In a general sense, I think it's very difficult for anybody to argue that a continuation of resource wars, the likes of which we've seen in the Congo that kills 5.4 million excess lives, is in the net best interests of local populations. I think that argument is a very difficult argument to make, and it's not clear to me that corporations get to decide in any event. I think that's a decision that comes from people on the ground and not from anywhere else. But in essence, I find it difficult as an argument because things look fairly bad from outside, and to say that they would be worse, I think, is a difficult hypothetical question and difficult to answer. In the specific, I'm skeptical about the argument because in a number of instances, we know for sure that the pillage of natural resources is achieved with slave labor. So to say that it's in the net best interest of local populations seems strange in that context. People are literally enslaved to do it. So again, I think it's a context-specific question that requires more careful thinking. Conceptually, though, I want you to observe how this argument effectively evacuates the idea of title in natural resources from conflict zones. What it says is we can't work out who owns natural resources. Notice how that makes natural resources res nullius, the thing of no one, which means anyone, if you have sufficient power, is able to seize natural resources and claim them, then they own them. Now that is a perverse system if your goal is to resolve resource wars, but more importantly, perhaps, it replicates colonialism. Res nullius was precisely the idea in colonialism. So on a conceptual level too, it seems like this argument that we should just do away with formal property in natural resources, that surely can't work as a long-term project. Let me come to the second set of objections, and they are about international humanitarian law. Now, the idea that international humanitarian law projects of itself is that it is a set of minimum humanitarian type protections that are applicable by both sides, regardless of who wins the war and who loses the war. And so the fundamental tenet is that, even if you're losing the war, you can't torture people, you can't execute prisoners, and so on and so forth. And part of the aspiration of international humanitarian law is that it will remain neutral between the parties in order to serve this basic humanitarian function. Now, part of the objection to pillage is that it effectively takes sides. It takes sides because governments will often control ownership of natural resources because they have the legislative power, they have constitutional powers, and they get to say who owns what effectively by using that legislative power. And this, say a number of people, is perverse because governments might not have stronger democratic credentials than the rebel groups that they oppose. Governments will probably have come to power on the back of illegal exploitation of natural resources themselves, and governments may not, their human rights record may be even worse than rebels anyway. It might be the governments that are the problem. And I think this is an important consideration. I think this is something that is, again, context specific. Part of my response to this is to doubt initially whether IHL is really conceptually possible. It's really possible for IHL to generate the sorts of neutrality that it claims for itself. I think inevitably it sets a set of standards that preference one type of warfare over another, but that's a slightly minor point. The broader point is that no no one has claimed that pillage is a panacea for all the woes of illegal exploitation of natural resources, or all the woes of human rights violations and international crimes in resource wars. It's a very limited aspect, and there should be different types of norms, different types of political programs that focus on government-side atrocity. So part of the answer is don't project onto pillage that it should be the solution, the silver bullet to all problems. It's most certainly not. It most certainly has to go hand in hand with a whole series of other types of initiatives. This brings us nicely to the final objection, which is of a series of critical ideas about the functioning of international criminal justice in these contexts. The first of these is, well, actually what you're doing here is normalizing capitalism, because what you're presupposing is the ability for people to alienate their natural resources in Africa on a straight market basis. And you make that assumption is to condone that form of alienation, as if that's ever going to be in the net best interests of Congolese people or people in any type of warring situation. That situation and that dynamic is always going to be one that's disadvantageous. In a way, focusing on corporations is scapegoating corporations for the larger problem, which is a structural problem about capitalism and globalization. Relatedly, there are a whole series of arguments that, well, what's happening here is that international criminal justice is actually soothing consumers' ethical dilemmas. So if you're buying a phone or a laptop or something, and you know that somebody got prosecuted for conflict diamonds or pillaging conflict diamonds, you'll feel much more comfortable about buying your phone or your laptop, when in reality, the ethical problem is much, much broader than any one prosecution can ever address. And so, in effect, international criminal justice is crowding out and playing down the sorts of ethical dilemmas that would actually have some positive effect, potentially, dealing with the problem. Similarly, part of the criticism is that international criminal justice makes this all seem so simple and precludes us from thinking about genuine political programs that may have some better effect on dealing with the dynamics of conflict resources. Part of the idea is, listen, international criminal justice is never going to be able to prosecute especially many people. Much better to have a political program that goes to the heart of the dynamics that are producing this reality than occasional criminal prosecution. So I won't say too much about these responses. I think many of them are very interesting and make for interesting research projects. My sense, though, is that there is a tendency within all of them to project a mutual exclusivity onto international criminal justice. That is to say, if you have international criminal justice, you cannot have something else along with it. It is effectively mutually exclusive with ethical programs, mutually exclusive with political agendas, which I don't think is true. And I think part of the initiative for international criminal justice must be, if it is going to play a role in these circumstances, to try and promote and to try and expose the limitations of its own field, but also to highlight the importance of other ethical and political attempts to address these dynamics. The one thing I come back to when I go to places in Africa, when I go to the Congo, when I go to conferences, to talks and things like this, is this particular idea. And I frame it as a question, and I genuinely pose it as a question. Is there a chance for long-term stability in a place like the Congo, which is enormously wealthy in terms of natural resources and has a very long history of pillage? Is there a chance for peace and stability in that context without a robust concept of title and natural resources and enforcement of violations of that title? And through all of this work, I keep coming to, I guess, a hesitation and a doubt that there could ever be a sense of stability without those things. So I'm grateful for your time. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person because of a prior engagement. I wish you a wonderful course and hope we have a chance to meet in person sometime. Thank you so much.